Imagine you are the leader of a country that does roughly 1.7 trillion Canadian dollars in annual trade with its neighbor, a neighbor that has recently threatened to annex you, called your prime minister a governor, and slapped tariffs on your steel, aluminum, and key industries. What do? You do what any rational economic actor would do. You look for other partners. And when the most logical alternative partner happens to be the country your neighbor considers its greatest strategic rival, the situation becomes something considerably more complicated than a trade dispute. That is exactly where Canada finds itself in early 2026. Prime Minister Mark Carney flew to Beijing, shook hands with President Xi Jinping, and signed what he called a landmark agreement, exchanging access to the Canadian market for Chinese electric vehicles in return for relief on Chinese tariffs that had been strangling Canadian farmers and fishers. Within days, President Donald Trump, who had initially praised the deal as exactly what Canada should be doing, reversed course and threatened to impose 100% tariffs on every Canadian good entering the United States if Ottawa went any further. The same week, Carney stood before an audience at the World Economic Forum in Davos and declared that the old American-led international order was, in his words, over. A standing ovation followed. A tariff threat followed that. What is really happening here is not simply a trade story. It is a story about the remaking of the global economic order, one bilateral deal at a time. On January 16, 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney concluded a 4-day visit to Beijing, the first trip by a Canadian head of government to China since 2017, by announcing what both sides described as a new strategic partnership. The centerpiece of the agreement was a tariff exchange. Canada would allow up to 49,000 Chinese-made electric vehicles into the Canadian market annually at the standard most favored nation rate of 6.1%, down from the 100% tariff that had been in place since October 22 for down and return. Beijing committed to reducing its tariff on Canadian canola seed from approximately 84% to around 15% by March 1st, and to removing so-called anti-discrimination tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas for the period from March 1st through at least the end of 2026. According to the Canadian Prime Minister's office, the deal would unlock nearly 3 billion Canadian dollars in export orders for Canadian farmers, fish harvesters, and processors. Carney described it as a partnership rooted in value-based realism, an acknowledgement that Canada engages with the world as it is, not as it might wish it to be. The reaction was swift and revealing in its contradiction. On the same day in Washington, Trump told reporters the deal was a good thing and that Carney was doing exactly what he should be doing. 8 days later, the U.S. president posted on Truth Social threatening 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Canada proceeded with the agreement, warning without apparent irony that China will eat Canada alive. Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc clarified that Ottawa had no plans to pursue a full free trade agreement with Beijing. The arrangement was a targeted resolution of specific tariff irritants. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent subsequently narrowed the U.S. threat to apply specifically if Canada became, in his words, a drop-off port for Chinese goods entering the American market. The episode exposed in sharp relief the volatile unpredictability of U.S. trade policy under Trump and the increasingly urgent calculation Canada is making about its own economic sovereignty. The roots of this story stretched back further than most headlines suggest. Canada and China had been building a quietly productive bilateral relationship through the first decades of the 21st century, anchored by Canadian agricultural exports, particularly canola, of which Canada is the world's leading exporter, and Chinese manufactured goods. By 2024, according to Canadian government trade data, China represented Canada's second-largest trading partner, with Canadian exports to China valued at approximately 30 billion Canadian dollars and imports totaling around 88.9 billion Canadian dollars. The relationship fractured spectacularly in December 2018 when Canadian authorities arrested Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou at Vancouver International Airport on a U.S. extradition request. Beijing responded by detaining two Canadian citizens, former diplomat Michael Kovrig and businessman Michael Spavor, in what became widely characterized as hostage diplomacy. The two men, known collectively as the two Michaels, remained imprisoned for more than 1,000 days before their release. In September 2021, coinciding with the resolution of Meng's legal case, relations remained deeply strained even after that exchange. The next rupture came in the autumn of 2024, when the government of then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau followed the United States in imposing 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, citing concerns about Chinese government subsidies and overtures. Beijing responded in March 2025 with 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil, meal, and peas, and 25% tariffs on pork and seafood, measures that effectively closed the Chinese market to key Canadian agricultural sectors. By August 2025, China added canola seed to its retaliation, imposing a tariff of approximately 76%. According to CBC News, the cumulative effect of these measures caused China's imports from Canada to fall 10.4% in 2025 to approximately 41.7 billion Canadian dollars. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's return to the White House in January 2025 had already set the bilateral Canada's relationship on a turbulent trajectory. By the time Carney, who replaced Trudeau as Liberal leader and Prime Minister in March 2025, traveled to Beijing in January 2026, he was operating in a dramatically altered geopolitical context, one in which the traditional assumption of Canadian economic security anchored by the United States was no longer guaranteed. Understanding this story requires mapping for distinct actors, each with a coherent internal logic. Mark Carney and the Canadian government are navigating what may be the most consequential foreign policy moment in Canadian history since the Second World War. Carney, a former Bank of Canada and Bank of England governor, came to office with a technocratic reputation and a clear analysis. Canada had become dangerously over-reliant on a single market. The United States absorbs roughly 75% of Canadian exports, and Trump's tariff threats and pointed suggestions that Canada might one day become America's 51st state had underlined the structural vulnerability this dependence creates. The Canada-China deal serves multiple purposes. It provides relief to Canadian prairie farmers and Atlantic fishers who had been economically punished by Beijing's retaliatory tariffs. It signals to Washington that Ottawa has leverage and alternative, and it advances Carney's stated goal of doubling non-U.S. exports by 2030 and increasing exports, specifically to China, by 50% over the same period. Domestically, Carney faces criticism from Ontario Premier Doug Ford and auto industry unions who argue the EV deal threatens Canadian manufacturing jobs, and from Conservative opposition leader Pierre Poilievre, who noted the apparent contradiction between Carney previously calling China the biggest threat facing Canada and now announcing a strategic partnership with Beijing. Donald Trump's position is defined above all by unpredictability. His initial endorsement of the Canada-China deal and subsequent reversal within 8 days illustrate what Moshe Lander, a professor of economics at Concordia University, described to CBC News as a deliberate strategy. In order to have leverage over Canada, you need to make sure that Canada doesn't have options. Lander's analysis suggests the tariff threat was not primarily about trade mechanics, but about coercion, preventing Ottawa from developing the optionality that would reduce Washington's negotiating leverage, especially ahead of the scheduled 2026 review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Trump's framing of Canada as a potential drop-off port for Chinese goods also reflects a broader strategic anxiety in Washington that any normalization of Canada-China trade creates a backdoor into the North American market that circumvents U.S. tariffs on Chinese products. Xi Jinping and the Chinese government have their own clear interest in deepening ties with Ottawa. Trump has imposed steep tariffs on Chinese goods, and Beijing has been systematically seeking to demonstrate that U.S.-led economic decoupling is neither inevitable nor universally accepted, even among America's closest allies. As San Chenghao, a fellow at Tsinghua University's Center for International Security and Strategy, told Reuters, China is highly unlikely to pull Canada into strategic misalignment with Washington, but it can use a pragmatic Canadian trade relationship as evidence that economic alternatives to U.S. dominance exist. The canola market matters to China practically as well. Canadian canola seed is a critical input for Chinese cooking oil production, and supply disruptions affect Chinese consumers directly. Canadian domestic stakeholders are themselves divided. The province of Saskatchewan, which accounts for more than half of Canada's canola production, was represented by Premier Scott Moe during Carney's Beijing visit. Moe called the deal a very positive day for Canada-China relations. Atlantic fishing communities welcomed the removal of tariffs on lobster, crab, and other seafood. Ontario's auto sector and manufacturing union, by contrast, expressed alarm at the EV provisions, with UNIFA President Lana Payne describing it as a self-inflicted wound to an already injured Canadian auto industry. The economic stakes are substantial and multi-directional. On the Canadian agricultural side, the deal's immediate significance is considerable. Canola is Canada's most valuable field crop, with China historically representing its second-largest market after the United States. According to the Globe and Mail, the Chinese market for Canadian canola seed was valued at approximately 4 billion Canadian dollars in 2024. Beijing's tariffs had effectively shut off that market. The Canola Council of Canada reported that total exports of canola fell by more than 2 million metric tons compared with the same period a year earlier after China's August 2025 measures took effect. The reduction of the canola seed tariff from approximately 84% to 15% by March 1, 2026, represents a fundamental reopening of that trade channel. Greg Cherwick, president of Pulse Canada, told CBC News that Chinese tariffs had effectively stopped all shipments of yellow peas to China, a market worth approximately 700 million Canadian dollars annually, and that Canadian exports were being displaced by Russian competitors. On the electric vehicle side, the dynamics are more complex. The 49,000 unit annual quota at a tariff of 6.1% roughly matches the volume of Chinese EV imports in 2023, before trade tensions escalated, and represents less than 3% of Canada's domestic new vehicle market. According to the Canadian government's own figures, the deal also includes provisions for Chinese automakers to establish joint ventures with Canadian partners within 3 years, with a commitment that by 2030, more than half of those imported vehicles will be priced below 35,000 Canadian dollars, a threshold designed to make EVs accessible to middle-income consumers. The legal analysis firm Norton Rose Fulbright noted that the deal also extends existing remission measures on certain Chinese steel and aluminum products through the end of 2026, retroactive to January 1st. The broader economic picture for Canada is shaped by Trump's tariff campaign. Multiple U.S. tariff measures on Canadian steel, aluminum, and sectoral goods have created direct and indirect economic pressure on Canadian industry. Carney's government has responded with a stated ambition to reorient the Canadian economy, reducing its dependence on the U.S. market through expanded ties with China, the European Union, Japan, India, and Qatar, all of which Carney has visited or engaged since taking office. Expert opinion on the Canada-China deal divides broadly along two axes: its economic rationality and its geopolitical risk. On the economic rationality side, analysts are largely sympathetic to Canada's position. Zhang Wenren, founding director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta, told China Daily that Trump's threatening reversal reflected personal pique and strategic coercion rather than substantive trade concerns. He argued that Trump's threat is designed to enforce U.S. dominance in North America and deter other U.S. allies from pursuing independent trade policy. Lander of Concordia University made the point that Canada's deal does not actually create a significant backdoor for Chinese goods into the U.S. market. Chinese EVs entering Canada would still face U.S. tariffs if re-exported southward, meaning the drop-off port narrative does not hold up economically. Trivium China analyst Evan Rogers-Pei, based in Beijing, told Reuters that given the complexities in the Canada trade relationship, it was no surprise Carney's government was seeking to improve the bilateral relationship with Beijing, which represents a massive market for Canadian farmers. On the geopolitical risk side, analysts are more cautious. Sun Qinghao of Tsinchuyu University told Reuters that Canada remains a core U.S. ally and deeply embedded in American security and intelligence frameworks, and that a strategic realignment away from Washington is very unlikely. The more significant risk, several analysts argue, is the 2026 USMCA review. Article 32.10 of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, known colloquially as the poison pill, clause provides that if Canada enters into a free trade agreement with a non-market country, a designation that China holds in us trade law, the United States and Mexico may terminate USMCA with 6 months' notice and form their own bilateral deal. Simon Evanet, a professor of geopolitics and strategy at IMD in Lausanne, wrote in a November 2025 report that such provisions transform trade agreements from purely commercial instruments into tools for managing partner countries' broader foreign economic policy orientation. Carney's team has been explicit that the China agreement is deliberately crafted to fall short of a free trade agreement precisely to avoid triggering Article 32.10. Ottawa characterizes the arrangement as a resolution of several important tariff issues, not a structural trade partnership. The range of plausible scenarios spans considerably. In an optimistic scenario, the deal provides Carney with negotiating leverage heading into the USMCA review, demonstrating to Washington that Canada has credible alternatives. Trump's tariff threat recedes once its domestic economic costs become apparent and the canola sector recovers. In a pessimistic scenario, Trump follows through on the 100% tariff threat. The USMCA review becomes acrimonious, and Canada faces a dual economic pressure from both its largest partners simultaneously. The most likely scenario, according to most analysts cited across the research reviewed here, lies between these poles. tactical tension, sustained uncertainty, and a slow Canadian diversification that neither fully replaces the U.S. relationship nor abandons. The reverberations of the Canada-China rapprochement extend well beyond the bilateral. For the United States, the episode represents a visible crack in the Washington-led economic coalition against Beijing. If a founding member of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, a NORAD partner, and a neighbor sharing the world's longest undefended border, is publicly negotiating a strategic partnership with China and describing Beijing as a more predictable partner than Washington, a formulation Carney used explicitly during his Beijing visit, the symbolic damage to U.S. global credibility is real, regardless of the deal's practical scope. For China, the agreement is a diplomatic and strategic win disproportionate to its economic size. It provides Beijing with a template, engage pragmatically with middle powers that are feeling squeezed by Washington's pressure tactic, offer them economic relief, and extract political and symbolic concessions in return. It is also consistent with China's parallel efforts to deepen ties with the European Union, with ASEAN members, and with emerging market economies, all designed to demonstrate that decoupling from China is neither feasible nor universally desired. For other US allies watching this episode, Australia, Japan, South Korea, the members of the European Union, it raises a pointed question. If Canada, with its extraordinary depth of integration with the United States, is recalibrating toward China under Trump's pressure, what does that suggest for their own choices? The Globe and Mail reported in November 2025 that US negotiators have been inserting more aggressive poison pill provisions in bilateral trade deals with Cambodia and Malaysia, provisions even more restrictive than the USMCA's Article 32.10. The logic of economic loyalty testing is spreading, and it is generating exactly the resentment it was designed to prevent. For Canadian agriculture, fishing communities, and EV consumers, the immediate impact is tangible. Canola futures rose on the day the deal was announced. According to Reuters, lobster fishers in Prince Edward Island welcomed the lifting of Chinese tariffs on their catch, the broader signal that Ottawa is willing to spend political capital to defend the interests of primary producers who had been left exposed by Beijing's retaliatory measure, has resonance across the Canadian hinterland. Several markers will indicate how this situation develops in the months ahead. The most immediate is the 2026 USMCA review. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement is scheduled for its mandatory joint review this year, and the Canada-China episode has injected new tension into what was already expected to be a difficult renegotiation. Whether Trump uses the review as leverage against Ottawa's China engagement, or whether the sheer economic interdependence of the two countries moderates his approach, will define the trajectory of North American trade for years. Observers should watch for whether U.S. negotiators raise Article 32.10 explicitly during preliminary discussion. The second marker is whether China follows through on its tariff commitment. The relief on canola seed, canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas was framed as running through at least the end of 2026, not as a permanent adjustment. Whether Beijing converts these temporary measures into durable reductions or uses them as tactical leverage in ongoing negotiations over Canadian steel and aluminum tariffs, which remain in place, will tell analysts a great deal about the depth of Beijing's commitment to the partnership. Third, watch for Chinese EV investment announcements in Canada. The deal includes a 3-year timeline for Chinese automakers to establish joint ventures with Canadian partners, a provision designed to address Ontario's concerns about job losses. Whether concrete investment materializes and on what terms will determine whether this deal functions as a genuine economic partnership or primarily as a political statement. Finally, watch the domestic politics in Canada. The Conservative opposition and Ontario Premier Ford remain critics. If trade negotiations with Washington deteriorate significantly, or if Chinese EV imports visibly displace Canadian auto jobs, the political cost to Carney could be substantial. Strip away the tariff percentages and the diplomatic communiques, and what remains is a story about a country being asked to choose not just between two markets, but between two visions of how the world is organized. For 7 decades, Canada's economic strategy rested on a bet that the United States would remain a stable, rules-based partner whose interests and Canada's would largely align. That bet is being stress-tested in real time. Mark Carney's answer: pragmatic engagement, strategic diversification. The world as it is, rather than as we might wish it to be, is neither a pivot to Beijing nor an abandonment of Washington. It is an attempt to restore the negotiating equilibrium that Canada needs to protect its own interests. Whether that attempt succeeds will depend on factors largely outside Ottawa's control: the temperament of a U.S. president, the patience of Chinese negotiators, and the capacity of Canadian institutions to navigate a global trading system that is being remade, one tariff threat at a time. What is already clear is that the old assumption that Canada's relationship with the United States was so deep, so structural, so mutually beneficial that it could never seriously be threatened can no longer be taken for granted. That realization, more than any single trade deal, may prove to be the most consequential outcome of this entire episode.